they're already a huge menu of issues and ideas to work with. So I'm going to hand over to Gemma, who's going to put us right in the middle of the COVID crisis.
I am going to put us right in the middle of the COVID crisis because that's very much where my work has been. The title may or may not sum up what it is I'm really talking about. I am focusing on what I think is a genuine political crisis in England around education. And that is because the DfE's handling of the pandemic has left to a complete loss of confidence. Well, no, I'm going to use a different word, has led to high levels of contempt on the part of teachers for what the DfE has been doing. And for the first time in ages, it really does feel like a revolt is going on the ground. Part of this is to do with poverty, and that's what I want to talk to you about. Along the way, what I'm hoping to cover are what I see as the responsibilities of the researcher, and also unpick a bit the number story that is keeping us in England in particular where we are. So if Judith can move us on to the next slide, what she will show you is the title. Oh, hang on a minute. Yeah, that's the title of the project I'm speaking to. And it's called A Duty of Care and a Duty to Teach. The language is deliberate. We put that in there because the reason this project exists at all, there was news coverage of a head teacher called Zane Powells, you can Google him and find him, who, when the lockdown happened, started on a tramp around his local patch, delivering free school meals to the families from his school. He now reckons he's done 750 miles and shifted 5 tons of food in the time that the COVID has been impacting on schools. So what that showed to me very early on, as soon as I saw the news clip, is that many teachers gear to their schools, they care for their pupils. And yet we live in an education system that has no metrics for care, let alone care for poverty, but actually caring for poor students was where the most urgent call was. And teachers didn't wait for resources to arrive from government, they just went ahead and did something. So a duty of care and a duty of teach was not trying to decide what are the impacts of COVID, how many lessons have got lost, how many children are kind of stuck in appalling homes. Instead, what we wanted to focus on was what's been the response of teachers. So we wanted to reframe this as a way of capturing teacher agency. If we move on to the next slide, I'm just putting these up for note, really. This is just some stats on child poverty in the UK. Yes, it's a serious problem. It's a serious problem compounded by changes to the welfare state, which mean if you're a family with more than 5 children and you're on welfare, you'll only receive benefits for 2 children. Now that's a Malthusian solution to the poor outbreeding, what the state is prepared to pay for. Actually, it's produced acute child poverty in some households in the UK. If we move on to the next slide, this is the last attempt, and I want to show this because it's the last attempt by politicians to capture the impact of poverty on children and their potential to escape. All right, that's in itself very peculiar way of framing the question. It was published in 2014 and 2015. This government abandoned the target to reduce child poverty in the UK by 2020. All right, and why it's there is because it shows to me some of the ways in which the numbers game that plays around poverty goes in the wrong direction. So if we look at the column on the left-hand side, what we see is a huge load of factors that belong to the family. They're their fault. And the question is, can they turn those around and use them to escape? So educational attainment becomes highest on the parachute your way out of poverty guys list. I just think the dynamics to that conversation is very, very curious. If we go to the next slide, what I want to get at there is the strong framing of the link between child poverty and education. So in the UK, education is the answer to child poverty. Higher wages for families is not. Better welfare care is not. No, The responsibility for child poverty and for an end to poverty in our communities is for children to get on the education escalator and find a way out. It is true that the coalition government in Britain introduced, I think in 2011, pupil premium. This is top-up funding to bring quality education to the poor. It was a liberal part of the coalition initiative. Some commentators believe that that money is badly spent. They call it inappropriately spent when it goes on, for instance, schools funding free school meals for children over the summer holidays when they have no other source of reliable nutrition. That's thought of as a misspend, because actually where the spend should be going is on the teaching, because that's the way you'll get families out of poverty and the kids will end up with better paid jobs. That's a very long time to wait. So built into policy is a notion for why resourcing better quality education in schools servicing the most disadvantaged families doesn't work, is that teachers, parents, students have poor aspirations for those in them. And I listened to the Minister for Schools in the UK sounding out exactly that prescription again and again and again in an Education Select Committee inquiry just this Tuesday. Okay, so if we move to the next slide, I think this produces terrible dilemmas in England, because we end up with gap talk framing the educational debate. And what we end up concentrating on is why there is a gap between the socially disadvantaged and the advantaged. Think about the vocabulary a minute, that might give us a clue. And what we then end up concentrating on is why the gap is impossible to close. But I want to unpack that and think about why the gap is impossible to close in terms of the assessment metrics that drive our notion of what the exchange is around teaching and learning. So in the English system, we have very frequent norm reference tests. Okay, norm reference tests means there'll be a big bulge in the middle where you expect everybody to be, and then there will be those down at the bottom. Roughly 30% of our kids fail these norm reference tests, and those up the top who are doing better than average. Schools are judged on the results, and you get very high penalties if you're on the lower side of that norm reference curve, as a result of which you can expect a hostile takeover, as a result of which staff are less likely to stay in those schools, as of which there is huge instabilities built into the system for the very schools you claim, politicians claim they're trying to resource the most. Curriculum delivery pace is kept very high, and that is now the dominant mode of thinking about the English education system. The assessment frameworks, with testing pretty much every 2 years in primary school, tell you that this is how fast the curriculum has to be delivered, and that the school that doesn't keep up by the exam test results it shows simply can't have spent enough time delivering the curriculum well enough. This assumption is being voiced right now by Ofsted in the middle of a COVID crisis, and it's also that complete collision between this logic built on curriculum delivery at a fixed pace and what it is possible to do under the circumstances under which schools have been disrupted in our country, which is actually producing, I think, an unutterable political dilemma. But out of that political dilemma, there's also an opportunity for change. So if we go on to the next one, I do hope I'm not talking too fast. I just want to, I put this up, I'm not going to read through it, you're going to have to read through it and listen to me at the same time. I have been analysing all of the bids that ESRC awarded for its COVID fund, looking at education, and this, what's on the screen right now, exemplifies a very strong strand of what's going on. There are a lot of people out there who are trying to measure what's got lost by virtue of closure, by virtue of not enough remote devices in poor families' homes, by virtue of, we've got a very long list there. This one is actually particularly concerned about mental health, technology, and the researchers are asking money to do the calculation of what's gone missing, and then they promise they'll come up with whatever it is they think their solution is. If we look at the timescale over which most of these projects were funded, they've got, most of them, quite a large amount of money, 200, 300k. I'm thinking, what does that amount to in time? Our project got 75k. It was a 4-month project. We've already finished, collected our data and got it out there. This raises problems for me about what are these researchers thinking that they're doing in terms of the nature of the problem that's actually facing schools on the ground. Right, if we go on to the next slide, that's just saying where we are, and anybody who gets the slide set can go find us. They'll find the full details of the project. All you need to note here is we've done a lot. We've done a lot in a very short time. Right, if we go on to the next slide, these were our fundamental questions. How have primary schools responded to the needs of their communities? All right, so we're immediately assuming that Zane Powell's school, where he's out there with his rucksack, tramping around the streets with the free school meals to deliver to families, isn't everywhere. There will be some other context where schools are not having to supply kids with food. That is not their immediate priority. So we know that will be different responses, and what that signals to us is something that gets completely forgotten in the escalated debate about education, namely that schools operate as community hubs. In fact, they are about the last institution standing in the English system that is there in every community and can operate for every community, and many of them during COVID did. The agenda for change, I think, has spiraled during the COVID time because of the gulf between what the profession sees as a need locally, how they're having to act, how they're having to reinvent what they do, and what policy thinking has been telling them to do. The most obvious example of the ludicrously out of touch policymakers is the fact that it became law in England in November, passed without proper debate in Parliament, for schools to supply 4 hours of remote online teaching for every child who might be at home. Hang on a minute. This is in a country where we know we have a very poor IT infrastructure, where there are loads of families without Wi-Fi, never mind laptops, where even if you had sufficient laptops, because you might have been given them by a government grant which was completely inadequate, actually you may only have one room in which 4 or 5 siblings are having to follow synchronous teaching from their schools all at the same time. This is actually not possible. So the reality check is what's possible to do on the ground versus what politicians can actually see, and it's completely shifted the balance in a system of education that normally runs on high level control through a high stakes testing and accountability regime. Okay, if we go on to the next one, that's just a list of the methods that we used. The most important thing to signal off that list is our first survey was run by TeacherTapp, and TeacherTapp, I won't explain fully who they are, but they can reliably tell you, those teachers answering, what is the social deprivation in their area, because they know their unique reference numbers. So we produced data that is actually valid in terms of its sensitivity to differences in catchment areas. If we go on to the next slide, what you will see, and I know you'll have difficulty reading this, but this is a graph in which we have got the responses to a question about what was your highest priority communicating with families during the first lockdown. And what this is showing basically is that reacting to families' needs in terms of mental health, welfare, food was more important across our data set than supporting children's learning. So on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, teachers were trying to react to that care first. Care, their duty of care mattered more than their duty to teach. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, this is showing you the difference in responses according to social deprivation or numbers of pupils on free school meals. Over on the left, we have the most affluent least disadvantaged schools. Over on the right, we've got the most deprived schools. And what you will see is that things like helping parents access free school meal vouchers, that's much more important for the most disadvantaged schools. About double the amount of time is going in the most disadvantaged schools on providing information on where families can find additional support. Everybody, yes, is concerned about mental health, welfare, food, but we know that those disadvantaged schools, this will be taking up a larger amount of those schools' time. If we go on to the next one, what you will see here is that poverty limits what families can do. It fundamentally makes a difference because of its material dimensions. This is not to do with social capital, or cultural capital. It is absolutely materiality of poverty is impacting. And the first graph, there's probably the sharpest difference, because almost half of those in the most affluent schools are reassured that most families can cope and have the necessary resources to support children's learning. The second graph is just those schools that are most affluent are also getting faced by most demands from parents, as in, why aren't you doing better with your learning agenda? So both of those imply that the middle class children are actually getting better resourcing out of the COVID crisis than those that are in the most disadvantaged. Okay, if we hop on down to the next one, I'm not going to bother on that because we all know that disadvantaged families have got much more problems about accessing digital, so we can hop straight through that one and get to the next slide. I think all of what is happening right now, there is a kind of ongoing tussle going on between the teaching profession, who've been at the front line, and what politicians and researchers, a large part of the research community, says should happen next. This is playing out around two terms: learning loss, which is to do with the calculations of what that level of increased disadvantage is, and catch up. And one of the most interesting things for us from our survey data is that teachers did not think catch up was the answer to the problems they were facing. Why not? Because catch up works on the logic on the slide, and what it means is that those who've fallen furthest behind have to run fastest to catch up. And that's why we are now seeing floated in the Tory press the idea that school holidays should be shortened, school days should be lengthened, poor kids should basically be sent to learning boot camps and made to spend more time in school so that they can catch up. So the blame game that I was talking about early on is running out absolutely now around COVID, but a lot of teachers are refusing to accept it. If we move on to the next slide, what we've been trying to do as a result, as a research project, is to reassert the value of what schools themselves know and how that enables them to act as a vital community resource at a time of need. There is a lot in the disaster recovery literature. And after all, disasters happen worldwide all the time. The disaster recovery literature is very clear that local knowledge is much better at helping people get back on their feet, and is an important ingredient in them so doing than parachuting in advice from afar. And yet much of our research community response to COVID has been for researchers to presume that they will be able to offer the advice from afar and then ship it into schools. So for us, that's fundamentally not the right way round. What we therefore did in our project is made our main dissemination point schools. So we can sense this kind of fury, if you like, going on in schools, and also a kind of sense of madness because schools themselves can't hear any replication of their own experience in the press. So we've tried very hard to push our results back to schools so that they can recognise that they're not crazy. They're on the right side of this argument, and all of the press stuff that's going on is actually irrelevant. Stick to your guns. So that's where we've got to. If we try the next slide, I can't remember what it is, but right, okay. In summary, what we've been trying to do is not give teachers practical tips, but instead fuel political opposition to what's going on and try and stretch what we think needs reimagining. One of the most obvious signals throughout our data set is that politicians no longer pay any attention to teachers themselves. They have no point of contact with teachers. They have no idea what's going on, and consequently, even if they wish to, which they don't, they could not be informed by what's going on the ground. That's a really big structural issue in the English system. We've dismantled local authorities. We fragmented the system into multi-academy trusts. There is no overarching means of those at the bottom communicating with those at the top. It needs repair. We think it is self-evidently true that our most deprived schools operating in our most deprived communities need higher levels of funding, and that the funding needs to cover all of those multi-dimensional aspects to poverty that Lebo spoke of in her presentation. It's not about extra teaching so that you can catch up. It is about attending to food, mental health, welfare. They've got to be part of the picture. At the moment, they're not even mapped and assessed by Ofsted when it goes in. It's only interested in teaching. It isn't interested in the quality of the care offered. We also fundamentally think that we have to change our punitive high stakes accountability system, because that's what leads to this fast delivery. And we think coming back out of COVID to a fast curriculum delivery system is fundamentally morally wrong, number one, and also it won't work. It simply won't work to bring people back to where it is they need to be. So if we move on to the next slide, this is my final slide, and it's really what I was seeing as sort of coming back into this forum. It is about thinking about the role of research in promoting change. A lot of what I am seeing is researchers not engaging in the English context in genuine co-partnership work. Again, think back to what Lebo was talking about. Think back of the strength of engaging with the experience of poverty on the ground as opposed to the metrics. What difference that would make to the way in which we think about these issues. So I think the researchers themselves have to think about their responsibilities to the communities they wish to work with. And that means work with. It does not mean work on. It means looking for co-partnership working. It means thinking through what are the networks and avenues that are available to create partnerships. English system, very, very complicated, because the thing itself is so disaggregated. It's so disparately. I mean, I could talk a long while about how it is we're trying to solve that conundrum and find the networks you can plug into. We've done something very quick, but actually to shift the game, we really need a long-term engagement. On whose terms? How can we make sure that our voice isn't drowning out the voice of those we're seeking to help, but we're still in dialogue with them? A lot of this is fundamentally about reframing the numbers game, and I'm going to come back to the multidimensional aspects of poverty. I have been trying to think about that, including with quant researchers here, how you could get a better metrics on poverty within our education game. That's not easy. Revisiting whose voice gets heard. I think we are working on behalf of others. That seems to me to be core. And also the thing that researchers, I think, bring to this kind of exchange is we are fundamentally equipped to handle uncertainties. I believe that's a core value of research. Research has been cast as the source of ultimate wisdom. So the politicians say we're following the science. The scientists keep on saying back to them, the science is uncertain. All right. Scientists, researchers, we are trained to handle uncertainty. We need to do a better job of it. And also we need to reclaim that that is our core skill. Okay, that is me done. Sorry about the speed.
It was very, very comprehensive and apposite, Gemma. So